Welcome to the Persuasive Mindset, your podcast guide to mastering the art of persuasion by exploring its role across diverse fields through in-depth conversations with experts. I am your host, Dr. Serena Maté de Londres. Today, we have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Laurent Balmelli, General Manager of Citrix Secure Developer Spaces, and a technologist whose career spans cutting-edge research, global corporate leadership, and entrepreneurship. In this episode, Dr. Balmelli reflects on how secure developer platforms are built in a world defined by cloud computing, speed, and constant technological acceleration. Drawing on his work experience at Bell Labs and IBM Research in New York and Tokyo, as well as on founding startups later acquired by Snapchat and Citrix, he shares with us what it means to move continuously between ideas and execution. As well, we discuss the topic of leadership and how he does not have a typical day. We look into the strategic role of storytelling in product and company building and what academic rigor still offers in an age of AI-generated code. And when it comes to persuasion, Dr. Balmelli makes a clear distinction. For him, persuasion is not about manipulation, but about clarity and about crafting narratives that help people understand why a product or a company or an idea truly matters. He also shares some practical insights on the startup mindset, Swiss-inspired approaches to innovation, and concludes with advice for students and early career professionals who are navigating the future of software and technology. Therefore, whether you're interested in secure software, entrepreneurship, leadership, or persuasion in highly technical environments, this episode is for you. Now, let's dive into our conversation with Dr. Laurent Balmelli. Enjoy! As we start our conversation, I'd like to ask, what are Citrix and Secure Developer Spaces? As well, what is your current job?
Citrix is a company that provides secure remote access to computing resources. And to me, it's always been a mythical company because I know it since I started working with computers. And what we created at Citrix stems from the startup that I created in 2020. And Secure Developer Spaces is meant to be a mechanism to give access to developers on an environment that is actually suited for modern development, which is mostly cloud native and web-based development, in a way that it provides security and also alignment with typically all the processes that are used today for efficient code development, which in this case is like something that is referred to as DevOps, which is a contraction between development and operations. And this is basically the goal of that platform that we created called Citrix Secure Developer Spaces. And my current job is to be the general manager for that platform. And the goal here is to align everything from business outcome in terms of customer adoption with the engineering effort that is required, the product management effort that is aligned with these goals. And it's like managing a small company without Citrix. And actually, Citrix is now organized with a series of general managers. So each product is, I would say, managed holistically in the sense that that person, the GM, be responsible for business outcome and also technical outcomes.
And then is it fair to say that your typical day is not really a typical day, it just changes depending on what the needs are?
Let's put it this way. Whatever makes things better in terms of business outcome should be my typical day, right? Whether I need to deal with aligning issues with the product, making sure that we have the right message with the customer, making sure that our team in the field are acting in a way that it's the most efficient from how we understand what should be the rules of engagement of typically a salesperson with the customer. So it could be pretty much, as I say, it could be anything. The role of the general manager is to coordinate things, but also to be extremely hands-on. At least that's just the approach that I'm taking myself. I think if you're not hands-on, it's difficult to understand the struggle or the needs of the specific functions, put it this way, like the product function. If I don't understand the product in detail, and especially new features that are required or like to follow the market or to make sure we can measure with the competition, it is difficult to be efficient. So I guess it's always a balance between being hands-on and creating concrete artifacts. Could be anything from a analyst briefing or even working on the design of a specific features to making sure that we have the right approach to a certain customer. So anything that could make the business move forward, that's my daily job.
Okay, thank you so much. And you also mentioned right now that you need to make sure that you have the right message for the client. What do you mean by that particularly?
I think it's all about the storytelling of a role like the GM. I think it's very similar. It's not exactly the same to the role of a founder. You need to be able to create a narrative around your product. So there's a story of the product, right? That needs to be well understood and articulated. When a customer asks you, hey, what is your product doing? Why do you believe this is the product that has no equal and that is the best for our business? I think this is really something that needs to be crystal clear. And somehow it's something that is always moving. Obviously, the message will settle at some point with the product maturity, but especially in emerging markets and what we do with secure developer spaces, where it's really an emerging market, although it's becoming more and more clear for customers what are the business benefit of such a product, you still need to articulate things. When I was back at IBM, there was a way you were saying we need to educate the market, and this is always something that stays true, I think, with any product.
And as we think about different kinds of products, could you give us an example of another kind of product that could be built using secure developer spaces within, for example, the finance sector?
In the domain of finance, there will be a lot of value that will be attached to the way you solve a problem. And the way you solve a problem could be an algorithmic approach to predicting or assessing the value of a security and how do you need to trade this, how you need to make sure that you maximize your profit around a transaction around that security. So that's in general terms, this is something that investment managers will do, or anything that an investment banking would need in terms of support, algorithmic support. And that's a typical product that could be designed with secure developer spaces, because the IP that is attached to that product is important, and you want to make sure that developers working on this, they can actually secure the value of that intellectual property. I think this is typically way secure developer space will be used. So if you think of an enclave where developers can actually create something that brings value to the company, it could be protected at the same time.
When I did some research on Citrix, I saw that the company serves customers all over the world. And I'm curious, how do you go about serving such a broad market?
Citrix has customers all around the world. I think there's no limit to this. There's also obviously a way we can optimize business of delegating some of our customers to partners. And this is something Citrix has been extremely successful doing by, I would say, prioritizing which customers should be dealt with first and having not a part of the market, which is perhaps more granular, provided to partners that basically can operate at a finer scale. Think of it like, for instance, like Citrix will handle customers that are large needs, and obviously will pay large sums of money to be supported by Citrix. But there's also a whole ecosystem of smaller companies that benefit from the technology, and these smaller companies will be better handled by partners. Basically, think of it as boots on the ground, and partners will be operating directly. It could be an SME, right? It could be a local company with a few hundred employees, and in that technology, and that business will be better handled with partners. So this is the way actually the market has been segmented by Citrix, with working hand in hand with partners.
Based on what you're telling me, your work right now is super complex. And I'm very curious to look a little bit in the past and think about your education.
Yeah.
What kind of education did you pursue? I've seen on LinkedIn you've done a PhD and at PFL in communication systems and mathematical signal processing. Could you please describe what is that?
So step back like 20 years ago, I got my PhD in 2000, right? So it's 25 years ago. And at that time, think of it, end of 90s and beginning of the 2000s, a lot of things were happening around communications. Mobile communication was emerging. A lot of the infrastructure network were morphing into fiber optics and this type of things. There's been a lot of investment in infrastructure this time, which, by the way, ended up in the dot-com crash because we built too much capacity at the time, which eventually got used, but there was a correction in the market at that time. Perhaps something that was quite trendy at the time was to study communication systems, basically linked to mobile communication, network communication. So I actually studied at EPFL on computer science, and I got my diploma in 96. It was an engineering diploma. And then I got the opportunity to do a PhD in communication systems, which was an emerging, it was a division at the EPFL at that time. It became a department eventually, but it was a division. I think it was connected to electrical engineering at the time. And I did my PhD in that field. In my case, I dealt mainly with attempting to optimize 3D models. And when I think 3D models, think of the one you would use in computer consoles, gaming consoles. I think they're used for computer graphics. And we wanted basically with my thesis advisor to take a mathematical approach to that problems to say, hey, how can we actually optimize this type of representation in order that it will be efficient when you render, communicate, and use this type of representation. So that's something that took me 4 years, and I eventually got my PhD in 2000.
And based on having done a PhD after that, did you notice transferable skills between academia and your first job?
Yeah, 100%. I think the only benefit I'll find in doing a PhD is the approach to problem solving and the fact that you can have some rigor and especially, I would say, in a structured way to provide an answer to any question. And that's something that I don't think it's not one day where I don't have a structured approach. When I'm asked a question, I would say, okay, what is the state of the art and what could be done? And I think one thing that is necessary when you do a PhD is that the first task of a PhD is, what's the really important question to ask before you try to find the answer? Because if you don't have a relevant question, it's not going to be, I would say useful, because I don't claim that every PhD is useful. But if it is useful for yourself, I think if you start with finding a question, it will be much better than just having a question trying to find an answer. I would really, the latter will be more doing R&D. If, this is a question and please find me an answer. I think real research and PhD is like, what's a good question to ask, and then try to find an answer. And if that answer is not the best one, you might have a really good question somebody else will solve. So I think that's a real PhD.
Do you think that in the field you're currently working, it's necessary to have a PhD education?
It depends what you do, right? And it depends also what are your expectations. I think it's not necessary, because I don't claim that people can have a structured approach to problem solving without doing a PhD, but I think it helps. So I think having a PhD will give you that will help you find a way, especially I think in many cases, a creative way to give an answer, because creativity is like everything, right? It's trained, right? You need to train to be creative. Like you need to go, that doesn't make any sense. And I think if you don't have that type of training, it's more difficult to be confident when you deliver something that say, that's not completely stupid. It might not be the right answer, but at least I had an approach that structure that's not like something you did in 5 minutes and something that, that might add some meat attached to it, right?
I'd like to move chronologically, if you agree, to think about after you had finished your PhD, then you started working at IBM in New York, from what I read online. And I'm curious to learn more about, was that a pivotal moment?
So I was in New York already for part of my PhD. I was lucky enough that my thesis advisor had a relationship at the Bell Labs, which actually was owned by the time by Lucent Technologies. And Bell Labs has been also a mythical place because it basically where the telephone was invented, right? This is really a lot of PhDs in physics and or Nobel Prizes worked there. And so it was a really cool place at the time. And so I was lucky enough to basically work there and be more than a year as like an internship, and then when came back to Switzerland a few months to wrap up my thesis. And then lucky enough, when I was looking for my first job, at the time was lucky because it was 1999 and there was a lot of opportunities in the US for people with PhDs and high education, because there was so many demand for engineers and for people that can work in research lab in particular. I got a few offers, but one of them was actually from somebody in New York that I actually met in Bell Labs and that moved to IBM Research. And that did came the offer, and eventually I settled to go to IBM. I had another offer on the West Coast with HP Research. Eventually I said, hey, I think East Coast is more my style. So I moved to New York and started working. In retrospect, I think that was perhaps one of the best decisions I ever made, to move to the US and to work in New York, because this is really different from the environment that I used to know in Switzerland, and everything brought to me a lot of experience.
And then I saw you also worked in Japan after.
Yeah.
How did that juxtapose with the experience from New York?
Yeah, so Japan was almost like I would say it came like a huge opportunity, but I had Japan in my mind since I was a kid. I always liked Japan. I like cartoons, Japanese cartoons when I was a kid. I like robots, and I think that all the robot aspect of a thing attached to Japan really something that I liked when I was a kid. And I thought, yeah, why not? So there was an opportunity that came up with a team in Japan. I think perhaps this is the opportunity I was really looking for. And I moved to Japan in 2006. At the time, I was married already, so I moved there with my wife and continued with IBM Research, but the Tokyo Research Lab. And I continued working there for 5 years. So I spent 5 years in Japan. And I think in terms of experience, something really different from what I knew in New York, especially you can guess from the cultural side, right? Japan is not a usual place. There was a lot of adjustment necessary to really also fit with the culture. But IBM Japan, this is what they say themselves. They're like, it's really a Japanese company. It's IBM, but this is Japan, right? So things are definitely done differently. And from a customer standpoint, I think it was great because I could also meet customers there. And again, culture is different. So a lot of learning as well.
And how is the difference in the team dynamic between the US, Swiss market and Japan market? Is such a big question, but if anything stands up to you.
Yes, the patterns. I think in the US, it's really, I would say, a culture of openness. And also, I think there's less red tape when you do research. And in Japan, there was a lot of things about the not invented here type of mentality where Japanese teams were sometimes uncomfortable if like the technology, even if it is part of the same company, in that case IBM, if some ideas, which it's perhaps the best way to describe like an early product, were not from the Japanese team, right? So it is an interesting thing that it's not only IBM Japan, we can find this, it could be Sony and some other Japanese companies, where there could be this non-invented here type of mentality with the things. And for Switzerland is hard to describe. I never worked in research in Switzerland. All my experience in Switzerland was around entrepreneurship. And I think there it's yet a different culture, but I can assure that patterns of communications and research and diffusion of this product from the lab to the customer is very different from Japan, from between the US and Japan. I could talk about this just for hours. There's so many aspects of it. Yeah.
It sounds super interesting.
Yeah.
If I may, I'd like to pivot towards your experience in entrepreneurship, because if I understand, and this, what we've already discussed, we're setting the grounds for you to then create something on your own. And I just want to ask, what was that journey like and what did you create as a startup?
I think my experience with entrepreneurship came from realization that my time at IBM was up, and I was thinking, hey, I spent 12 years at IBM, and I'm not sure exactly what else I can do and how much growth I can get. Also, I was getting towards my 40s, so when I left IBM, I was actually just before 40. I think I was 38, 39, something like that. And I was thinking, why not trying something by myself, which I think I was tempted to do this before, but like every cocoon that you put in and you're getting comfortable with, it's difficult to get out of it. Whether it's your academic environment with your PhD, it's so cool. I have so many people I know that actually never got out of PhD, although they finished their PhD, they're still at university and they're still like working as a collaborator or anything, any title you can find. or like being in a company for very long where you're very comfortable with the life and you're trying to survive every job cut that they have periodically as a, hey, I dodged it one, so let me. I think at some point it's good to take a chance and just go. And I think that first experience was really life-changing for me. Going into entrepreneurship was something that took me almost a two-step, right? When I left IBM, I was convinced that this is what I need to do now. I want to create something personally. And then think of the next 2 or 3 months after I left IBM, I was like, oh shit, what did I do? Was it like a really good idea? But you get used to it. I mean, one thing is that when you jump out of the boat, you get used to uncertainty. I think that's perhaps something that is a first gain. Whether you succeed or not, that's a good thing.
Another aspect that seems really complicated for an entrepreneur is to choose the right team. And to me, from the outside, it seems quite hard to not only figure out a good product, but also to make sure that you pair up with partners that complement your work and your personality. I'm really curious to hear what are your views on this point.
I agree. And I think it's always going to be the defining aspect of your company, and perhaps also one of the defining skill that you can have as an entrepreneur, right? It goes both ways. So in my case, for the first company, Strong Code, I actually met some people who wanted to bring an idea, or more precisely an MVP, which stands for minimal viable product, or perhaps like just a prototype, I think, because we were not sure we was viable or not at the time, to bring a prototype to market. And so I got in touch with these guys, and I was in Switzerland for a few years now, and coming back from Japan, having left IBM. And I just came out as an opportunity. But in that case, the team was imposed to me because basically the people contacted me, and I think you're dealt a number of cards. And this is the cards you have to play with. And now this is your hand, right? And try to do the best with what the card you were dealt. And from that standpoint, I think this is where if you're lucky, things will go right. If you're unlucky, things will go wrong. But most of all, I think it would put to test your skills of your managerial skills and skills also of being able to reach consensus, to be able to appease, to be able to motivate people. And I think even if you're given a team, I mean, if you don't have the luxury of choosing your team, then these skills, these soft skills, I think they become extremely critical.
And also, when I saw you give a talk last time, and I'm going to paraphrase you, I think.
Yes, go ahead.
You basically said a startup is not a job, it's actually a vocation. Could you please expand on that and explain this type of mindset?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think creating a startup is something that is going to be requiring a lot of energy, right? And it's something also that's going to bring a lot of doubts, and something that will require you to be extremely focused. And it's so many things that are converging towards the same goal, making sure that thing works, to put it simply. That, it's going to be something that really requires you to be extremely motivated. So a vocation is something that you don't need to remember why you're doing it when you wake up in the morning to say, hey, this is what I'm going to do today. It's something that, this I'm made for. And I guess this is what I mean by a vocation, is that, this is something they like to do. And then you can find which aspect of things you like to do, because I don't think you need to be the Swiss knife. You can do everything. It could be, your stuff is to create the product. Your stuff is to sell the product. You still have to do engineering. And this is where I have conviction that creating a startup is not a one-man show. It's a conjunction of skills, and you need to also, for that reason, if you can, choose the right people.
Mm-hmm. My work focuses on understanding persuasion from different fields, and I'd like to make sure that I ask you, what is your definition of persuasion, and what role does it have in your work?
So persuasion is a key skill for creating a company. And there's many means of persuasion, right? The first one is storytelling, right? If you can't craft a narrative around the product for a startup, but also around the company, right? There's around the product is not sufficient. You can do around the product when you're a company like I am now with Citrix, and you create that narrative around the product, motivate your team on the product. you need to have also the same thing, which sometimes is the same, is there's kind of a blur between the product and the company, because the product is the company, right? Usually a startup is doing one product, they don't do multiple products, right? So the product is the company. You build a narrative around that. Is basically, I think, the root of persuasion, is that you create that narrative. Obviously, you need to, needless to say, you need to be convinced yourself, but you need to convince others. And there's so many stakeholders that you need to deal with, from your employees, that you need to make sure that they follow you, they're motivated, they understand the urgency, and your customer, they understand that this is the product that they need. It's something that, you know, they're gonna be happy when they use something that's gonna allow them to make progress. Key aspect of the adoption of any product, you have to feel progress. This is how we adopt product. We adopt product because, hey, I can do something very useful with it. And then in sales, how can you sell something if you cannot persuade a person? I read, like, later, actually before my second startup, I read like this classic book of Robert Cialdini, The Art of Persuasion. I actually advise everybody to read that book, because it's interesting, because I think it was written some time ago, but it's extremely relevant, because it gives very important examples and how you can nudge people to think something. And so I think there's a bunch of, I wouldn't say tricks, because at the end, I don't want people to feel they're tricked, because at the end of the day, everybody's trying to persuade everybody with different skills, but at the end, persuasion is the root of creating a company. Yeah.
And I want to pivot into the importance of storytelling, writing, and narrative. Mm-hmm. I've seen that you produce quite a lot of content online as well. Mm-hmm. And would you like to share what you're currently interested in telling entrepreneurs and young professionals when it comes to the importance of this?
Writing is something that I would advise anybody doing company to do, because there are multiple benefits to it. The first one will be to persuade yourself that you're doing something that has some meat around it, and that is something that is carefully crafted. There's a logic to it. This is consistent. And it's something that will help you also to get to the next step, right? That's the first thing. The second thing is that writing is a communication medium. You need to be able to communicate your ideas. And if you're able to lay out your ideas in a way that it's actually, I would say, first of all, pleasant, makes sense, then it's going to be very useful for you to convince your stakeholders, whether they're your employees, customers, investors, that you are on a track that it seems to make sense and people want to follow you on that track. When we raised money, first thing, that was for the second startup, I indicate, hey, you want to understand what I think about that area, just read the article, just read things. Interesting enough, I think this is something that changed a lot because of AI, and AI can write very often better than most people, but it's still something that needs to be done, right? At the end of the day, a lot of ideas will be your idea, and they could be put in a context in a way that it's actually more eloquent, that you might be able to do it, but it's still your ideas. When I started writing, especially to interest investors, ChatGPT was not there and AI was not used for that. But still, I think it's something that would be very helpful. So crafting a narrative, I think, is something that you need to learn early when you create a company.
And speaking of lessons learned, you also created a second company. Could you share what would be some key lesson that you think others could get inspiration from?
For the second company, in that case, Strong Network, after Strong Code. So just a step back on Strong Code. Strong Code was acquired by Snapchat in 2016, and the Strong Network was founded in 2020 after I left Snapchat. And the second company was very different from the first one, from different aspects. The first one is that obviously I had more maturity into how to create a company and what should or should not be done. But you can argue that this saying that you never step twice in the same river, because that's the best analogy. And because second company, it was like, it's another company. It's something that you have different people, you have different context for the market, different people who invest in you and so on. So the second company, I was lucky that I actually could choose my team at the time. So that was something that I was totally in control. Good thing. I partnered with one of my ex-employees at Snapchat, decided to follow me And I think that was a good choice. And then it was the same, I would say, problem to solve when you have to, hey, what are we doing? What are we conceiving? What's the idea, and how do I describe this idea? And even if you had that initial idea, which in this case, this is one of the interesting thing with at least I consider is as interesting for Strong Network, is that we actually never pivoted. There's something very often when startups, we have pivots because you have that idea, that doesn't work, let's do this, let's do that. We never had any significant pivot. The first thing I thought doing was like, hey, let's do a secure development for developers like Citrix, but much more aligned with the needs of today's developer and much more efficient in terms of performance and so on, because there's different choices of technology. And eventually we didn't change. And I say, hey, if there's anything that will be of interest, is that Citrix, they could get like a much better way to onboard developers that they would do today for modern development. And we got acquired by Citrix. So that was, there was a bunch of events that put together that it was a happy outcome, but we never really pivoted. So that's one of the things. But I don't think this is not very common. Yeah.
And time is flying. I'm really enjoying this conversation. I have 100 other questions. But I'd want to ask, in your field, should we be afraid of AI?
No, I don't think nobody should be afraid of AI. Are you afraid of the internet? No, you're not, right? I think the same thing. Nobody should be afraid of AI. I think it should be embracing AI. Being afraid of the future is natural, right? Everybody's afraid of the future. I'm afraid of the future for my kids. The planet that we leave for them. You can really ask yourself that question first before, anything. And anybody who has kids will understand that. So everybody's afraid of the future, but I don't think we should be afraid of the technology. The technology is there. The misuse of technology is something different. It's another problem. So AI is there. Guess what? There are going to be some misuses of the technology, and then you need, as much as possible, prevent that type of bad outcomes. But I think embracing technology is very important. And one thing that actually I think is really different from anything in the past is that the pace of technology keeps on accelerating, right? And I think this is perhaps somewhere where we need to be extremely careful because, there's not enough time to do everything. And I think if you can really become fluent in the use of these tools, and not using only ChatGPT to correct your emails or something like this, but really to challenge your own ideas, to go into philosophical discussions with something that I just did this morning. And actually, something I was doing this morning is actually discussing with ChatGPT about very philosophical questions in the realm of investments. But this is something that is not really an algorithmic decision to make, but more, hey, this is a philosophical investment thesis. It's actually extremely useful. And I was just texting my wife when I was doing this. I said, hey, discuss, because I mentioned to her last night, I want to discuss this with ChatGPT. It was something I'm thinking. And I told her, hey, it's humbling how smart that thing is, right? Sometimes I meet entrepreneurs and I say, hey, I have this idea for that thing. And I say, hey, did you challenge this with ChatGPT or some other AI? It could be Grok, it could be Gemini. I really love Gemini, by the way. The deep research of function of Gemini is super useful for me. So I keep on reading this deep research. But if you don't do this as an entrepreneur today, you don't challenge your ideas with this, I would be doubtful that you really went to the bottom of the question. I would really advise entrepreneur to make full use of this, but not only to generate code or do something, but really challenge your ideas. Sometimes there will be some hallucination, but that's fine. We can actually think hallucination could be equated to lateral thinking. Hey, we all be crazy sometime, right? And we come up with some weird ideas, but why not using that to our advantage? And if you have your own sense-making function that is properly working, then you can say, hey, that doesn't make any sense for now. Could make sense later, perhaps, but I think we shouldn't be afraid of AI.
And speaking of improving ourselves, how can interested students and entrepreneurs work with you? I've seen, if I understood correctly, you also teach in Japan, and then you're also a mentor here in Switzerland.
My class in Japan is really because I love Japan. I love being there. I have been working with a host there, professor there, who's a really good friend, like for the last 17 years. And I could teach anything there. I wouldn't care. And I really enjoy the time there. And I think what I was trying to do is a more mentorship type of relationship I have with the students there more than teaching, in the sense that we really, again, we look at questions that, I think would matter for them in their professional path. But to give an example about going into AI, actually, we only use AI for that class from the beginning. So we actually did a full class where everything we do, we're supported by AI. And the goal is to actually teach them how to put this to their advantage and not having the AI do everything for them, because that doesn't make any sense. But basically to use this, hey, this is the baseline. Now we have an oracle that gives us a lot of information that we can use. Hey, use this and you build something on top of it. As opposed to, hey, I give you a class and some people are going to use AI to solve some of the questions and so on. And I'm actually changing, especially this last 3 years, my class every year, because after 1 year, your class is obsolete. And this is interesting because I've exchanged some ideas with the professors there. Hey, they don't change their classes. And it's like, and Mario said, hey, anyway, I'm retiring in 2 years. I don't need to change my class. So yeah, long story short, mentorship is something that I really do like on a case-by-case basis. In Switzerland, I don't have any structural way to do this. I don't do this in the class. But I talk to an entrepreneur quite often, actually.
That's amazing. And I also saw, obviously, I met you at the conference. So you really do give back to the society by sharing your knowledge. Thank you so much. And before my last question, which is like your final words of advice, I just want to make sure that, is there any burning question that you'd like to answer that I did not ask you?
One of the questions I like is, do you perceive yourself as a developer first? And yes, I think because what we do today is very often ends up in code, right? Because the world is made of a lot of code right now. I think you share a developer of the idea, the initial put there, and the code is just one instantiation for that. Something that I like actually that I saw recently is that the fact that you start from a narrative that is your product and specification, then you generate artifacts from there. And I think it's a concept that is very interesting because a lot of people have ideas and they start coding immediately and so on. And for the sake of efficiency and time, you won't go through a specification that kind of narrates, give like an overview of your product before it's implemented. It's also seen as an old way to do things. Hey, let's write a specification requirements and then implement the product, right? Because it's too long. Let's go straight to the coding. And I think one of the good things of AI regarding code generation is that we have now time to go back to the specification and let the AI code the thing. And why is that important? Because at the end, it's more important to challenge your idea or to try to test the code for some outcome that you want to do. Because if the idea is wrong, you can test whatever you want. The outcome doesn't matter if it doesn't really, I would say, satisfy the market, right? So a lot of engineers are really happy and confident when they create code because they think they progress, they create a product. But if that product doesn't answer the real market question or market need, all the code you want will not do any good to your company. So I find it was interesting that once code is mostly auto-generated, we can go back to the more abstract reflection that what is the product supposed to do and what is the market problem you're trying to solve.
I love it. Thank you so much. So if I may, I'd like to ask the final question, which is basically... Basically for students and early career professionals who are inspired by your work and would like to follow in your footsteps, what would be the key parting advice?
The first advice is that don't follow too closely because, man, it's really a life of struggle, right? I think there's some kind of a masochism perhaps involved in the way I've done things, right? Because it's really not you put yourself to. But I think a good amount of struggle is really necessary, right, in anybody's life. And I guess make sure that you're doing as much as you can. That's one of the things, right? And you will stop where your pain threshold will stop you. But I think it's good sometimes even to go beyond that pain threshold and then because there's something basically to have weekly discussions with my kids. Hey, that sucks, but that makes you stronger, right? This thing didn't go well. Look, at the end of the day, it's just another learning. And so I would say I was in my late 20s. I think to me, at least, it was too early to go by myself into the industry and create something. And perhaps it was not. But at the time, I felt it was early. Now that I've actually past 50 for some years now. So I'm actually feeling much more confident. But I would say jump into it. Doesn't work. Hey, don't worry. You get back to your feet and do something better the second time. And one thing also that I think is good, find people to advise you, find people to support you, ask things. One thing that is interesting, I had the relationship with my kids now, it's much easier to have a dialogue between generations, which is sometimes uncomfortable based on the discussion. I don't know if you have kids, then you know that sometimes they ask a question, I can never ask this to my parents, but that's the way it is now. So I guess intergeneration conversation got much better. If you ask somebody who's 20 years older than you think about that, hey, that's not a bad question, or the opposite. And if the person in front of you has some empathy, they might actually give you a good answer. But all depends. Sometimes lady luck is involved, right, in relationship. So that's what I would say. Jump and ask for advices.
And that concludes our conversation for today. If you enjoyed this discussion, please be sure to subscribe, leave a comment, and share this episode with others who might benefit from it. Until next time, be well!